A quick edit before I begin. While playing this game, I lost my save file. I don't know what happened. I was playing the game, it crashed. When I restarted it, the save file was no longer there. Now, I did finish the game. The character wipe happened while I was in New Game Plus trying to get some footage, but buyer beware. This is a very serious issue that has not been addressed in any of the post-launch patches. Warning, the following video does contain story spoilers which I try to keep to a minimum, but you have been warned. There is a looming sense of dread when trying to critique a game that has been in early access. You just know that there is a group of people with almost 1,000 hours put into the game and they have some sort of emotional attachment by this point. So when it gets officially released, whatever that means these days, the game already comes with a dedicated fan base. These are quite weird times for the gaming industry, but with that being said, let's begin. In video games, spellcasters are usually relegated to simple-minded and straightforward skills since they commonly have to share the spotlight with characters that are not magic-based. Sure, you have people with magical abilities, but I'm talking specifically about wizards, mages and sorcerers, people who employ magic as their primary trait, and I kinda blame D&D to be honest. You see, in Dungeons & Dragons, the wizard role has to be incorporated in a rule set which also contains swordsmen, thieves, archers, bards, etc. And the magic classes become pretty quickly the guy with a fly spell or the girl with the fireballs. But D&D also has the direct social player interaction outside the rule set, which can preserve some of that sense of wonder that magic gives. Video games on the other hand do not have this, and since D&D had such a huge influence on the industry, the essence of the system was lifted wholesale. And this was the reason I was excited for Lichdom Battlemage, mainly because it's a game where magic is the sole mechanic and it doesn't have to share the spotlight with pesky swords or arrows. Battlemage is a weird game to classify. It doesn't fit in with any known genre well, so the best I can describe it as is an old school shooter that uses a more complex version of the Skyrim magic system with a hack and slash loot system that also advertises itself with a challenging difficulty in the same way Dark Souls does. Oh, and it looks real pretty. Before I start critiquing the game, I'm just gonna say that they did good work with the CryEngine 3. The textures look good and the particle effects look spectacular in most cases. Which is important since you're going to be throwing a lot of them around. The environments are well done also, complete with a lot of non-interactive items placed in the levels that give authenticity to the world. So while the art direction is not terribly original, I think it looks great by anyone's standards. Since there is the least amount to say about it, let's start with the story. Lichdom Battlemage takes place in a generic fantasy setting where a cult is trying to conquer/destroy the world. It's not exactly clear. You are given magical bracers that turn you into a battle mage by a sage named Roth, and you are made the dragon who, alongside the griffin, someone who received magical rings to act as a scout, must take vengeance on the leaders of the cult and generally save the world. Now the names are genderless because at the beginning of the game you can choose to be male or female, the other gender becoming the griffin. Now, I personally don't care, but I will mention it. I can see some people jumping at the fact that the cause for revenge in both male and female backstories is a woman. But it's just a minor detail fundamentally, and it's barely brought up in the game, so I don't think there is a misogynistic slant here. Maybe an oversight. Anyway, most of the world building is done through rifts that contain scenes from the past and text spread out across the level. It has a very Bioshock Infinite vibe to it, but it is well done. Overall, there are only two things of note I'd like to mention. First off, the fact that you can't die is acknowledged by the game, and let's just say that the griffin employs a very personal type of scouting.
Damn! Some goddamn cultist dragged me into the lava, and this again.
Well, it beats the alternative.
And the second thing I like to mention is that it's been a while since I saw villains this evil in a non-horror story. I mean, they are absolutely abhorrent. You will have no qualms about slaughtering them and the cultists wholesale, trust me.
Magnificent shot, your lordship. He led me a good chase, that one. I do prefer the strong runner. Of course, only the best will do, my lord.
Heaven shacks enough.
But now into gameplay. Battlemage tries really hard to balance 3 different types of games that have very different types of focuses and thus attract very different types of players. Let's start with a simple look at how the system works. The player has 4 ways of interacting with his environment. He has a projectile spell, an area of effect spell, and a block spell, which if you block perfectly, releases a wave spell around you called a nova. Beyond this, the player has a short-range teleportation move that when charged also releases a nova. To create a spell, the player decides how the spell will be delivered, what its element is, and one of 3 attunements, which are control, destruction, and mastery. The element decides the visual effects and what each attunement does. Examples work best for explaining. An ice projectile control spell will freeze an enemy, while a delirium projectile control spell will make him fight for you. Also, it's important to remember that you can only have 3 elements at one time to play with. As for health, you have 3 regenerating bars akin to Halo shields. Once all 3 pop, you are dead. But the exact function of these bars is dictated by what shield you choose. And honestly, that's the most important decision in the game since it determines your playstyle. And this is a game where mitigating damage is far more important than doing damage. Here's an image of what they exactly do, but the basic idea is this. Strategic shields are for players who want to rely on their blocking ability. Agile ones are for those who want to rely on their teleportation ability. And the tactical ones are a mix between the two. And since there is no trading here, they added options to completely recycle your loot. You can take apart spells to get one component back, you can upgrade components by sacrificing other components of equal level, or you can just throw them to be reforged, which fills up a meter that will eventually give you a legendary level component. All of this seems like a lot to take in, right? Well, guess what? The tutorial only covers the basics. Once you start this game, they throw the book at you. Be prepared to read. And my biggest complaint here is the use of proper nouns and arcane terminology. The names don't easily communicate what they do and what they mean. You know what perfect blocking is called? It's called galvanize, go figure. Or the fact that the mastery attunement has to do with stacking damage that is triggered by critical hits. It's ridiculous. The player has all the information from the start, but it's just so demanding to keep everything in mind when you begin. Fundamentally, Lichdom Battlemage tries to have 4 main attractions: the power, fantasy and pacing of an old school style shooter, the encouragement of player expressivity, the combination of Skinner box and the adrenaline rush feeling you get from hack and slash games, and the challenge of conquering hard games. Sadly, the result is a Frankenstein's monster of game mechanics with the strengths of none and the weakness of all. I'm going to go through these one by one, but keep in mind there is a lot of interconnectivity between these systems, so not everything I say will be immediately relevant. Okay, so why doesn't it work to make you feel empowered like an old school shooter? Firstly, while there are corridor sections, most of the game's levels are eerily similar to games like Painkiller and Serious Sam, in terms of size and even aesthetic at times, but their enemy count is so much lower. It seems so out of place to have such large and imposing environments and only a handful of mobs. I don't know if this is by design or a limitation of the CryEngine 3 that was realized much later. Secondly, there are too many player inhibiting mechanics, and this game is primarily about damage mitigation. I mentioned these two together since they are tied to each other. So what do I mean by player inhibiting mechanics? Well, creatures can slow you, prevent your blink, and even freeze you. Most creatures have shields which prevent status effects, and there are 3 creatures that you start encountering more and more often that can create shields, 2 of them even for allies. Also, the range of most creatures with projectile attacks is absurdly high. Basically, if they see you, they most likely can fire at you, and most projectiles are really small and their green particle effects get lost with the background, so it's not that easy to see them. I've been hit so many times with a projectile that I couldn't see due to my own spells. Oh, and I forgot to mention there is a creature that lands guaranteed hits on you unless you block perfectly or get behind cover, and there are even creatures that teleport around the map, some even unfairly behind you. Now by themselves, these abilities are not bad, but combined together, it turns the game into a bizarre puzzle, because you don't take a lot of hits, even with the highest health shields. So you need to prioritize very strictly on what you need to kill. Most melee creatures are basically ignorable and do nothing. The result is that you spend most of this game blocking, blinking, staying behind rocks and trying to kill the guy who is taking shots at you from the far end of the arena. Compare this to Serious Sam, where the objective is to not get swarmed by your foes. You must constantly kill them so you have manageable numbers. Of course you have the green demons and scorpions that you must prioritize, but the general premise of that game is to kill whatever is closest to you. Now, why doesn't the game work on the basis of player expression? Well, part of it is the aforementioned creature design. The more specific your encounters are, the more specific your counters to them must be. And thus a lot of the thousands of combinations drop off, since the difficulty in this game continuously spikes. You are less and less incentivized to experiment with your spells, since you need to be as effective as possible at all times. Compare this to a game like Magicka, which focuses entirely on player expression. The enemies, by and large, have the same behavior with not so many changes throughout the game. Thus, the possibility of trying new things without halting your progress is there. Now, back to Lichdom. The other thing that further hampers player expressivity is the fact that you have 3 elements which level up, and if you switch them out, you lose their levels. So you have to throw out the window all those hours you spent leveling up your elements to risk trying a new element that also needs spell components to make work, and you might realize you don't even like it in the end. And lastly, the game incentivizes you to use the least amount of spells possible, unless you want to grind, in which case have fun with that. Because a complete run through a level doesn't give you enough components to make every single spell you have powerful. To be the most efficient, you must try to have a complete answer to everything with the least amount of spells possible, so you can sacrifice everything you have into making those few spells powerful. And since we're here, I'd like to mention one of the worst design decisions I've ever seen in a game. I am not being disingenuous, I really believe this. If you combine 3 legendary components, you get a pattern. This pattern is a powerful spell that introduces a new mechanic. Basically, if you have 2 elements equipped, you will start gathering progress points towards filling up a bar when doing damage. The more the better. When this bar is filled up, you unleash a super special AoE attack. What's the problem? The elements that make up this synergy are completely random. It's essentially rolling your luck for gameplay, and your journal doesn't get updated with the effect of the pattern unless you equip it. So what that means is that you must switch your elements around, thus lose their levels, use spell components to make the pattern, and then find out if it's any good. I made about half a dozen of these things and only one was compatible with my chosen element. Look, I'm not saying that games that focus on player expression should be easy, but they should encourage the player to try new things and not pigeonhole them into specific playstyles. As for the hack and slash loot part, well, acquiring loot is just not spectacular. Here's how it works. After killing an enemy or looting a container, orbs fall down, after which they move towards you and the name of the spell component you picked up appears at the top of the screen. Which, by the way, got me hit more than once since I thought it was another projectile and I blinked away in an actual projectile. Afterwards, the player must open his inventory, scroll through this long list of items and then press shift to see if this is any good. The whole interface is just not user-friendly. Compare it to Diablo 3 where you can tell if the item is any good in 3 seconds after picking it up and identifying it, and not in 30 seconds like in Lichdom. Or compare it even to Hearthstone, a game that sells itself on its animations and such. People have even ritualized the way they open packs. And another issue here is that components are deceptively tiered. Rarity is not actually important, augment slots are. Which means that you can kill a boss and get a legendary spell component with only 1 slot, but from a simple kill or a container you can get an uncommon component with 4 augment slots that can be upgraded enough times to reach legendary, thus making rarity a moot point. And lastly, challenge. This game is clinical, not challenging. It's a laundry list of precautions that you must take, and it tests your patience more than your skill. With the exception of one odd encounter which had me die like 5 times due to one-hit kills, every single time that I died only once in that zone, boss fights included. Which means it's not a matter of skill, merely a matter of knowing where the creature spawns are, especially for those with special traits. And speaking of creatures with special traits, the reflective trait was mind-numbingly unfun in every single hack and slash game, and it's the same here. My favorite part was when you meet a creature with reflective and knockdown. You literally fall down to the ground each time it takes even the slightest bit of damage. So in the end, was there anything I really liked? Well, I thought the loot rarity modifier was a really nice touch. It reminded me of destroying checkpoints in Shovel Knight. You see, each time you pass a checkpoint, your loot modifier increases and you have a higher chance of getting better components. But in between these checkpoints, there are a lot of harder optional zones, and when you barely finish one of these with the fear of losing your modifier on death, it really raises the tension, even though you respawn right after you die with nothing lost except the modifier. It's a simple and effective method to encourage playing well, and it also has a risk-reward element. Before I close this up, there are 2 things I want to say. Blocking just isn't fun. I tried my best to play with it, but you are just so static and it feels like enemies are wailing on you all the time. Plus, the style is effective against melee, but your ranged enemies will laugh at you. And the last thing I want to mention is that this game is painfully long. All 3 sets of enemies that you will fight, undead, demon and human, get introduced by the 4th level, and there are 8 levels in total. This game doesn't have the mechanical variety to sustain its length. I'm gonna be honest, if I wouldn't have decided on making a critique of this game, I wouldn't have finished it. It took me around 16 hours to reach the end, but I can see it reaching 30 hours if you're struggling a lot. I think most players will probably be attracted to the novelty of this game, and it does make a good impression for the first 2 hours, but after that it just starts falling apart little by little, and I can't recommend it in good conscience, especially considering the price tag. Though, I will say that I'm slightly curious at what the developers will do next. Hopefully it will be a pleasant surprise, unlike this one.